Story 1.
I remember the day I married Janice as if it were yesterday, though it has been 12 long years. She was the epitome of beauty and grace, a dream in human form, radiating warmth and kindness. Our union was a celebration not just of love but of shared passions, a harmonious blend of our lives and dreams. For over a decade we reveled in a life that many would envy. I, a doctor, devoted myself to the well-being of the residents in our small, sleepy town. Nestled on the fringe of a massive national park, the town felt like a serene bubble, untouched by the rapid pace of the outside world. Janice, with her unwavering love for nature, worked as a ranger, a guardian of the vast, verdant forests of the national park. She was as much a part of those woods as the ancient trees and hidden trails. Our home, a quaint, cozy abode, stood proudly at the edge of the forest. It was like a sentinel, marking the boundary between our world and the wild, uncharted realms of nature. Our mornings had a routine that was almost sacred. Janice, equipped with her walkie-talkie and a thermos filled with steaming coffee, would kiss me goodbye and disappear into the woods. Her presence would linger in the house long after she had gone, like a comforting echo. I would then make my way to the hospital, driving through our town where everyone knew everyone and life moved at a leisurely pace. Our days were simple, yet fulfilling. Janice's stories of the forest would fill our evenings with excitement and wonder. I would share tales from the hospital, and together we would revel in the quiet bliss of our life. We were two halves of a whole, perfectly content in our world. But tranquility, as I have learned, is a fragile thing. A few days ago, everything changed. Janice left for the woods as she always did, but as the hours ticked by, she did not return. I sat at our kitchen table, a table that had witnessed countless breakfasts and dinners, a silent participant in our daily lives. I stared at Janice's empty chair, a void that seemed to grow larger and darker with each passing moment. I waited, listening for the crunch of her boots on the gravel, a sound that signaled her return. But as night fell, there was nothing. Just a deafening silence that seemed to consume the house, as oppressive as the dark, enigmatic forest that lay beyond our home. I recall every detail of that evening, the way the shadows seemed to creep in closer, the clock ticking monotonously, marking the passage of time and the deepening of my worry. I tried to distract myself with mundane tasks, preparing dinner for one, mechanically washing the dishes, all the while glancing at the empty chair, hoping against hope to see Janice walk in, laughing off my worry with an amusing tale from the woods, but she did not come. As the sun rose on the second day of Janice's disappearance, a gnawing sense of unease had taken root in my heart. The initial panic, a frantic burst of fear and confusion, had simmered down into a deep, persistent anxiety. The kind that claws at the back of your mind, relentless and unyielding. I knew I couldn't face this alone. I needed help. The only person I could think of was Robert, the local sheriff, a man I trusted as much as I trusted myself. Together, we plunged into the dense woods, a place I thought I knew, but now seemed alien and foreboding. We called out for Janice, our voices echoing through the trees, a desperate plea against the oppressive silence of the forest. There's a peculiar quality to the woods, a stillness that seems to absorb sound and amplify your fears. As hours bled into a full day, our hope dwindled, replaced by a growing sense of despair. Then, in a clearing beneath a canopy of towering trees, we found her. Janice lay there, as serene as if in slumber, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. But the tranquility of the scene was marred by the stark contrast of congealed blood on her clothes, partially torn as if in a violent struggle. My heart lurched at the sight, a mixture of relief and horror churning within me. Despite the blood, I found no wounds on her, a puzzle that only deepened my worry. Robert and I carefully lifted her, intending to bring her back to the safety of our home. But as we carried her, I couldn't help but notice her unusual heaviness, as if gravity itself was clinging to her more fiercely. Her body radiated an unnatural heat, the kind that spoke of a raging fever burning within. We rushed her to the hospital, the place where I had spent countless hours healing others, now a beacon of hope for the person I cherished the most. My colleagues, skilled and compassionate, sprang into action, their professionalism a comfort in the chaos of my emotions. Their assessments were thorough, yet they revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Janice's vital signs mirrored those of a person in deep, peaceful sleep. Her blood work showed no abnormalities, no hint of what could have caused her state. It was as if she had simply chosen to retreat into a world of dreams, locking herself away from us. Days turned into nights, and nights into days, with Janice remaining in her mysterious slumber. The hospital room, sterile and impersonal, became a sanctuary where I spent my hours, watching over her, hoping for a sign, a movement, anything. I would talk to her, recounting the mundane details of our life, the little things we often overlook. The way the morning sun filters through our kitchen window, the creak of the third step on our porch, the gentle hum of the refrigerator. I hoped these familiar details would reach her, wherever she was, and guide her back to me. But she remained unresponsive, a silent enigma. The lack of answers was maddening. The afternoon sun cast a muted glow through the blinds of the hospital room, creating a pattern of light and shadow that danced across the walls. I sat there, as I had for countless hours, holding Janice's hand in mine, the familiar texture of her skin a silent comfort. The book in my other hand, her favorite, had become a talisman of sorts, a connection to the days before the forest claimed her. I read aloud, my voice a steady rhythm in the quiet room, weaving the words into the still air. Then, without warning, she stirred. It was a subtle shift, a faint movement that might have gone unnoticed had I not been so attuned to her every breath. Her eyelids fluttered, and then, as sudden as a storm breaking, her eyes opened. The familiar emerald green, now clouded with confusion and something else, something unrecognizable. The surge of joy that filled me was indescribable, a burst of light in the long darkness. "Janice," I exclaimed, my voice a mix of elation and disbelief. But the relief that coursed through me was short-lived, cut short by the look in her eyes. It was her, yet not her. The warmth that had always shone there for me, now replaced by a cold, detached gaze. It was as if she was looking through me, seeing a stranger where her husband should have been. "Janice, it's me, Mark." I stammered, my voice trembling with a cocktail of emotions. My hand reached out to her, an offering, a plea. She didn't pull away, but the hesitancy in her touch, a tentative brush against my palm, sent a shiver down my spine. There was a disconnect in her touch, a distance that had never been there before. The hospital room, with its sterile walls and beeping machines, seemed to fade into the background. All that existed in that moment was her. Janice, the woman who had been my partner, my confidant, my love for over a decade. The woman who now lay before me, her eyes a mirror to a soul that didn't recognize me. The silence that enveloped us was heavy, laden with unspoken questions and fears. I searched her face for a sign, a glimmer of recognition, but found none. Her gaze was unfocused, her eyes drifting across the room, taking in her surroundings with a detachment that was chilling. Over a month has passed since that fateful day we found Janice in the woods, a span of time that has felt both like an eternity and a fleeting moment. The doctors, having exhausted their means of understanding, discharged her with a clean bill of physical health. But it was Janice's behavior, her very essence, that left me with a gnawing sense of unease. She was home now, but the Janice that returned was a shadow of the woman I knew. There was a coldness to her, a detachment that turned our home into a hollow shell. Her eyes, once vibrant and full of warmth, now held an aloofness that pained me deeply. She remembered everything, our wedding day, the first house we bought together, the names of our nieces and nephews. She even remembered me, but it was a clinical recognition, devoid of the warmth and affection that had once defined our relationship. When she spoke my name, Mark, it felt as if she was learning it for the first time, testing the sound on her tongue. "You're my husband," she would say, a statement of fact rather than an expression of love. Janice's craving for solitude intensified with each passing day. She had always cherished her moments of alone time, but now it was as if she was withdrawing into a world of her own, a place where I couldn't follow. She spent hours by herself, often in the room we had converted into a study, the door closed, her presence a silent rebuke to my attempts at conversation. Our conversations, when they did happen, were stilted, filled with an anxious silence that hung heavy between us. I would talk about my day at the hospital, the patients I saw, the small victories and the inevitable defeats. But her responses were brief, perfunctory, as if she was performing the act of listening without truly hearing. The house, once a sanctuary of our shared life, now felt oppressive, each room echoing with the absence of the woman she once was. The living room, where we had spent countless evenings watching movies and sharing stories, now seemed too large, too empty. The kitchen, once the heart of our home, where Janice would cook and hum to herself, was now a place of silence, the pots and pans untouched, the stove cold and unlit. Her presence in the house was like a ghost, a specter of the person she used to be. I would catch glimpses of her, moving from one room to another, her steps silent, her face expressionless. At times, I would wake up in the middle of the night and find her sitting by the window, staring out into the darkness, her gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. The change in her was not just emotional, but physical as well. There was a stillness to her movements, a deliberation that was unnerving. She moved like a marionette, her actions lacking the fluidity and grace that had once been so characteristic of her. Even the simple acts of everyday life, the rituals that make up our existence, seemed to have lost their meaning to her. She ate because it was necessary, not because she enjoyed the taste of food. She slept, but it was a restless, fitful slumber, punctuated by moments of wakefulness. I tried to reach out to her, to bridge the gap that had opened between us. I would talk about our past, the trips we had taken, the plans we had made. But my words seemed to wash over her like rain off a roof, leaving no mark, no impression. The more I tried to connect with her, the more she withdrew, retreating further into her own world. It was as if she was trying to solve a puzzle within herself, a riddle that she couldn't decipher. The Janice I knew, the vibrant, passionate woman who had walked into the woods that day, seemed to have been left behind, replaced by a stranger who wore her face but shared none of her spirit. Restless, I lay in our bed, the sheets twisted around me, a testament to my unease. The night was still, the kind of stillness that feels heavy, laden with unspoken words. Janice's absence beside me was a void, a palpable emptiness that seemed to amplify the silence. Sleep eluded me, its sweet release just out of reach, as I lay there, trapped in a limbo of wakefulness. It was then that I heard it, a soft, persistent knocking, a sound out of place in the quiet of our home. My heart skipped a beat, a jolt of adrenaline coursing through my veins. I lay still, listening intently. The knock came again, followed by the creak of floorboards. It had to be Janice. Silently, I slipped out of bed, my feet touching the cold floor. I moved cautiously down the stairs, each step a deliberate effort to minimize sound. The house felt different in the dark, its familiar contours cast in shadows that played tricks on the eye. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the sight that greeted me was like something out of a nightmare. Janice stood at the living room window, her figure bathed in the ghostly light of the moon. The moonlight, silvery and ethereal, seemed to wrap around her, casting her in an otherworldly glow. Her eyes were wide open, fixed on the moon, with an intensity that was unsettling. "Janice?" My voice was a whisper, barely audible, as I approached her. There was no response, only the eerie stillness that enveloped her. Without warning, her body convulsed, a violent, jerking motion that was so at odds with the tranquility of the night. Her head thrashed wildly, her arms flailing in a disturbing dance. The sounds that erupted from her were guttural, deep, and primal, unlike anything I had ever heard from her. It was as if some unseen force had taken hold of her, controlling her movements. Panic surged within me, a tide of fear and confusion. I reached out, my hands grasping her shoulders in a desperate attempt to anchor her to reality, to pull her back from whatever abyss she was teetering on the edge of. Abruptly, her movements ceased, her body freezing as if time itself had stopped. She turned to me, her eyes wide and wild, a look of incomprehension mixed with terror. Then, with a trembling hand, she pointed directly at me. The scream that followed was chilling, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of our home, a cry of horror and despair. Then, she crumpled to the floor, unconscious. I stood there, frozen, her scream still echoing in my ears, a sound that would haunt me for days to come. My mind raced, a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. I knelt beside her, my hands shaking as I checked for a pulse, relieved to find it steady beneath my fingertips. But the relief was short-lived, replaced by a deep, gnawing fear. What had happened to her in the woods? I gently lifted her, her body limp in my arms, and carried her back to our room. The weight of her, both physical and metaphorical, was a burden I carried with somber resolve. As I laid her on the bed, tucking the blankets around her, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding, a premonition that whatever had happened was only the beginning. The stillness of the night was deceptive, a mask hiding the turmoil that churned within me. Sitting in our bedroom, the moonlight no longer felt serene, casting grotesque shadows around the room. My heart thudded in my chest, a relentless drum echoing my growing dread. I reached for the phone, my fingers trembling, a cascade of horrifying thoughts racing through my mind. As I dialed the hospital, the sound of each number being pressed was a stark reminder of the surreal turn my life had taken. The line rang, a shrill sound in the quiet of the night, and I waited, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, a voice answered, a lifeline in the swirling sea of my panic. I spoke in hurried, broken sentences, my voice a mix of fear and urgency. The details spilled out, a torrent of words that seemed inadequate to describe the gravity of the situation. The operator's calm, professional tone was a stark contrast to my own, a lighthouse in the storm of my emotions. The wait for the ambulance was a study in agony, each moment a sharp stab of uncertainty. I sat beside Janice on the bed, her body limp in my embrace. Her breathing was shallow, each breath a whispered promise of life. I held her close, whispering words of comfort, empty reassurances that fell flat in the heavy air. The ambulance arrived, its sirens a wailing dirge in the still night. The paramedics, efficient and focused, were a blur of movement and urgency. They lifted Janice onto the stretcher, their actions methodical, a practiced dance of rescue and care. I followed them, my steps automatic, my mind numb. The hospital was a stark contrast to the soft darkness of our home. The lights were too bright, the colors too stark, the sounds too harsh. Janice lay in the hospital bed, a pale figure against the stark white sheets. Her skin, usually so full of life, was now a ghostly pallor, a canvas of fragility. Her eyes, open and staring, held a cold, disturbing clarity that sent shivers down my spine. The depth and warmth they once held were gone, replaced by an icy detachment that felt like a physical blow. The doctors ran tests, their machines beeping and whirring, a symphony of medical inquiry. They spoke in hushed tones, their words a mix of jargon and speculation. But the underlying message was clear. They were as much in the dark as I was. I sat next to Janice, holding her hand. Every moment I spent by her side was a reminder of the terror that gripped my heart, a gnawing fear that I was losing her, not to death, but to something far more incomprehensible. She didn't recognize the events of the night, her memory a blank slate that offered no answers. Sitting beside Janice in the sterile hospital room, the air thick with the scent of antiseptics and the underlying tang of fear, I felt a profound sense of helplessness. The desperation in my voice when I spoke to her surprised even me. Janice, please, you have to remember. When you disappeared, do you remember anything? Anything at all? Her reaction was subtle, a slight furrowing of her brows, her eyes losing focus as if she was trying to peer into a fog of forgotten memories. I can't remember, she murmured, her voice a mere whisper, a ghost of its former strength. Mark, I just need some rest. I'm just overworked, that's all. I'll be fine. The smile that followed her words was a feeble attempt at reassurance, a frail gesture meant to comfort. But this smile was a far cry from the one I knew and loved, the smile that had once lit up her entire face, making her eyes sparkle with joy. This new smile was strained, a forced curvature of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. It was alien, unfamiliar, a mask that hid more than it revealed. A lie that only further cemented my growing fear and uncertainty. I wanted to let out a scream, to unleash the turmoil brewing inside me, to rage against the cruel twist of fate that had brought us to this juncture. But instead, I remained seated, holding her cold, lifeless hand in mine. I forced a smile, a facade of normalcy, as I played the part of a supportive husband. We were just another couple weathering a minor storm, or so I pretended, even as my heart screamed in denial. Returning to the semblance of a normal life felt like stepping into an ill-fitting suit. The house, once a haven of love and laughter, now felt like a stage where a strange play was unfolding, with Janice and I as the unwitting actors. Janice returned to her job as a ranger, immersing herself in the woods that I now viewed with a mix of reverence and dread. She claimed the forest air made her feel better, a statement laden with irony that did not escape me. The very woods where this nightmare had begun were now her sanctuary, a place of solace that I could not comprehend. My days at the hospital were a stark contrast to the solitude of our home. The bustling corridors, the constant beeping of machines, and the myriad faces of patients and colleagues only served to amplify my sense of isolation. Each interaction, each medical case, was a reminder of my own impotence in facing the enigma that was my wife's condition. Each evening, as I drove back home, my heart would be heavy with a cocktail of dread and anticipation. The drive, once a time to decompress, now felt like a journey towards an unknown destination. The familiar scenery blurred past me, a backdrop to the tumult of my thoughts. Upon arriving home, the first thing that would hit me was the silence. It was a thick, heavy silence that seemed to hang in the air, laden with unspoken fears and unsolved mysteries. I would call out for Janice, my voice echoing in the empty space, a stark reminder of the distance that had grown between us. Her behavior had become increasingly unpredictable. Some days, I would find her sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the walls, her eyes distant and unseeing. Other times, she would be in the study, poring over old maps and books about local folklore, her brow furrowed in concentration. One moment, she would be almost like her old self, a flash of the woman I had fallen in love with breaking through the fog. The next, she would be distant and cold, a stranger wearing my wife's face. The uncertainty of it all was maddening. The hospital, with its antiseptic smells and rhythmic beeping of machines, had become my second home, a place of refuge in the chaos that my life had become. As I sat at my desk, lost in contemplation over a patient's chart, the familiar rhythm of my workday was abruptly shattered by an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Robert stood in the doorway, his typically jovial demeanor replaced by a somber, weighty expression. Over the years, Robert and I had forged a bond beyond mere acquaintances. Our friendship was a solid, dependable entity in the small community we both served. Yet today, as I looked up at him, I couldn't help but notice the subtle changes. His face seemed etched with new lines, a testament to a burden he was carrying, a mirror of my own torment. His gesture for me to step outside was filled with a gravity that immediately set my nerves on edge. We moved into the empty hallway, the usual hustle of the hospital fading into a hushed backdrop to our conversation. I was struck by an eerie sense of déjà vu, a premonition of unsettling news. "What's the matter, Robert? Is this about my wife?" I asked, my voice tinged with concern. His presence here, outside my office, could only mean something significant. He paused, his Adam's apple bobbing as he cleared his throat, a small action that spoke volumes. "Yeah, I found something in the woods. I think you should see it for yourself," he finally said, his voice low and steady. Those words sent a chill down my spine. The thought of the forest harboring another horror made my heart pound in my chest. Robert's reluctance to divulge details only increased my anxiety. What had he found? Was it related to Janice's mysterious condition? We agreed to venture into the forest the following day. The remainder of my workday passed in a blur, my thoughts consumed by what lay ahead. The familiar tasks of diagnosing and treating patients, once a source of fulfillment, now felt like hollow motions, a play I was acting in while my mind was elsewhere. The dawn of the next day enveloped the world in a gray, misty shroud, reflecting the turmoil within me. I awoke with a heart full of an inexplicable blend of excitement and trepidation, ready to embark on a journey that I knew could change everything. The mysteries of the forest, the enigma surrounding Janice, and the bizarre discovery with Robert. They all swirled in my mind like a restless storm. But as the morning wore on, an unsettling silence took hold. Robert, who was always punctual and dependable, was nowhere to be seen. Confusion first crept in, then anxiety, followed by a growing sense of dread. Robert was more than a friend. He was a confidant, a fellow traveler on this twisted path that fate had set us upon. His absence was not only alarming, it was completely out of character. I found myself pacing, my steps echoing in the empty house, each creak of the floorboards amplifying my rising panic. Repeatedly I dialed his number, each ring echoing hollowly in my ears, a stark reminder of the silence that answered. The unanswered calls were like a weight on my chest, each one tightening the knot of fear that was forming in the pit of my stomach. When I was able, the call connected. I was overcome with relief, but it was short-lived. Instead of Robert's familiar, steady voice, what greeted me was a sound that sent chills down my spine. Heavy, hoarse breathing, filled with a desperation and struggle that was almost palpable. And then, that low, guttural sound. A prelude to the scream that shattered the connection. A scream that was hauntingly familiar. A terrifying echo of the sound that Janice had made. Dropping the phone as if it were a searing coal, my mind raced with nightmarish possibilities. What had happened to Robert? The scream that had emanated from the phone was a sound that no human should make, a sound that resonated with the darkest fears lurking in the corners of my mind. Without a second thought, I bolted out of the house, driven by a need to find Robert, to understand what was happening. The air outside was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the fevered panic that gripped me. My car roared to life, the engine's growl a fitting soundtrack to my turbulent thoughts. Arriving at the sheriff's office, my heart pounding in my chest, I was met with more confusion. The deputy, a young man with a face too fresh for the uniform he wore, looked at me with a mixture of concern and puzzlement. "Sheriff Robert? He's been gone since yesterday, Mark. No one's seen him since." The deputy's words were like a cold hand clutching at my heart. Where could Robert have gone? Why had he not shown up for our planned journey into the woods? The pieces didn't fit, each one a jagged edge that cut into my understanding of the world. Driving back home, my mind was a whirlwind of theories and fears. The quiet streets of our small town seemed surreal, a facade of normalcy that masked the chaos that was unraveling around us. When I saw Robert's car parked outside my house, a surge of hope momentarily lifted the weight on my chest. But it was quickly replaced by a fresh wave of fear as I noticed the fresh dents and large scratches marring the vehicle's surface. They spoke of a struggle, a violent encounter that defied explanation. My heart raced as I approached my house, the familiar structure now a stage for the unknown drama unfolding within. As I entered, the sound of casual conversation wafted toward me, a normalcy that felt out of place. Janice and Robert were chatting, but their tones were hollow, the timbre of their voices missing the warmth I remembered. I paused at the threshold, observing them. Their smiles were eerily similar, strained, unnatural, as if carved from the same unsettling emotion. Robert's eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something undefinable, a glint that was quickly masked by the facade of normalcy. The coldness in his stare mirrored Janice's, a chilling reflection of the change she had undergone. "I just forgot, Mark," Robert said in response to my queries about our missed journey into the woods. His voice was casual, dismissive, but his smile lingered unnaturally, as if it was a mask he had forgotten to drop. As he left, his departure was hasty, almost frantic. I watched his car drive away, a sinking feeling in my gut. The sight of his vehicle, with its fresh dents and scratches, only deepened the mystery. What had happened to him? And more importantly, why was he now exhibiting the same disturbing behavior as Janice? Robert's strange behavior, his sudden abandonment of the planned trip to the forest, only added to my fears. I didn't know what to think or what to do, but I had to get an answer to the question: what's happening to my loved ones? The night enveloped our house like a dark cloak, its shadows stretching across the rooms, painting a picture of isolation and mystery. I lay beside Janice, her form a mere silhouette against the faint moonlight that filtered through the curtains. The echoes of the day's events reverberated in my mind, a haunting chorus that underscored my growing sense of unease. My thoughts were a maelstrom, swirling with fears and questions, each more disturbing than the last. The guttural screams that haunted my memories, Robert's abrupt change, and Janice's transformation. They were pieces of a terrifying puzzle that I was desperate to solve. Their forced laughter, once a melody of joy and companionship, now rang hollow in my ears, a discordant note in the symphony of our lives. I turned to look at Janice, her breathing steady in the quiet of the room. The woman beside me was a stranger, a far cry from the vibrant soul I had fallen in love with. The realization that I was losing her, that I was losing myself along with her, was a weight that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. It was then that Janice stirred, her movements slow and deliberate. I feigned sleep, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched her through half-closed eyes. The rustling of the sheets was a soft whisper in the stillness as she slid out of bed, her silhouette a ghostly presence in the moonlight. There was a purpose in her movements, a determination that was both alarming and compelling. She moved quietly, her steps careful and measured as she made her way out of the room. My mind raced with the possibilities of where she might be going, the forest looming large in my thoughts. After a moment's hesitation, I followed. My movements were cautious, a silent pursuit born of a desperate need for answers. The creak of a floorboard underfoot was a thunderous sound in the oppressive silence. I trailed Janice down the hallway. She moved with an eerie grace, a specter gliding through the night. My heart was a drumbeat in my ears, each step taking me further into the unknown. As we stepped outside, the cool night air was a shock to my senses. The world was bathed in the ethereal glow of the moon, the trees casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. Janice moved with a purposeful stride, her destination clear, the forest that bordered our home. I followed at a distance, the grass damp beneath my feet, the night sounds a chorus that accompanied our moonlit journey. The forest loomed ahead, its trees dark sentinels against the sky, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The edge of the woods was a threshold, a line between the known and the unknown. Janice didn't hesitate, stepping into the shade of the trees with confidence. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and followed. My heart was a frenzied drumbeat in my chest, each thud echoing the mounting fear as I watched Janice venture deeper into the heart of the woods. Her movements were erratic, disjointed, like a marionette with its strings pulled by unseen hands. Her head turned abruptly from side to side, her body swaying with a rhythm that was discordant and chilling. The most terrifying moment came unexpectedly. Janice dropped to all fours, her movements becoming beast-like, primal. She darted forward with an inhuman swiftness, her form blurring into the darkness. The sight was surreal, a nightmare come to life, leaving me frozen in disbelief. In mere seconds, she had vanished into the abyss of the forest, leaving me alone with the oppressive silence. My fear turned to an all-consuming terror, a vice-like grip around my heart, squeezing the breath from my lungs. The forest's chorus, a symphony of rustles and creaks, was more pronounced tonight, as if the trees themselves were speaking in hushed tones, narrating a tale of the unknown. As I stood there, trying to process the horror of what I had witnessed, a rustling sound from behind caused me to whirl around. The memory of Robert's chilling scream over the phone flooded back, heightening my sense of panic. My eyes strained to pierce the darkness, to discern the figure that had materialized from the shadows. The moonlight was a fickle ally, casting more shadows than it dispelled. I could barely make out the shape that approached, a form that seemed to shift and change with each step. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it Janice returning, Robert, or something far more sinister? I stood still, tense, ready to run at any second, but it was a stupid thought. I couldn't run from a creature like Janice. I watched as a figure emerged from the darkness and drew closer. In the heart of the forest, under the haunting glow of the moon, I faced David, Janice's co-worker, a ranger known for his amiable disposition. But the man before me now bore little resemblance to the cheerful figure I remembered. Perched on a fallen tree trunk, he regarded me with a menacing stare, his eyes reflecting the wildness of the forest around us. He seemed more a creature of the woods than the ranger I knew, his posture tense, like a predator poised for attack. My heart thundered in my chest, a rapid drumbeat echoing the fear that seized me. The danger was palpable, the air thick with an unspoken threat. David's transformation was another piece of the enigmatic puzzle that surrounded me, a puzzle that grew more complex and disturbing with each passing moment. In a desperate bid to defuse the situation, I found myself mimicking Janice's bizarre actions from earlier. Dropping to all fours, I replicated her movements, jerky and unnatural, and emulated the guttural sounds that had emanated from her. It was a gamble, a wild attempt to communicate or connect with whatever had taken hold of David. For a moment, he just stared at me, his gaze intense and unyielding. Then, without warning, he unleashed a scream that pierced the night, a sound so primal and terrifying that it reverberated through the forest, sending shivers down my spine. And just as abruptly as he had appeared, David vanished into the darkness, leaving me alone in the eerie silence of the woods. The encounter left me shaken, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The events of the night, Janice's transformation, Robert's unsettling behavior, and now this confrontation with David were overwhelming. With a heavy heart and unsteady legs, I began my trek back to the house. Each step was a labor, my body weighed down by the terror and uncertainty of what lay ahead. The journey back through the forest was an odyssey through a world turned nightmarish. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches interlocking to form a dark canopy above me. The moonlight filtered through the leaves, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor, transforming familiar paths into an alien landscape. With each step, I was acutely aware of the sounds of the night, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a nocturnal bird, the soft tread of my own footsteps. The memory of my encounters with Janice and David, their transformed states, sharpened my senses to every rustling whisper of the forest. As I ventured deeper, the guttural sound that I had come to associate with this transformation reached my ears. It was a disturbing, animalistic noise, one that sent a chill down my spine. Despite the danger it signified, curiosity propelled me forward, treading cautiously through the dense undergrowth, my heart pounding in my chest. Emerging into a clearing bathed in silver moonlight, I was confronted with a sight that defied belief. Before me, the clearing was alive with movement. Familiar faces from our town, David, Janice, the sheriff's deputy, and others, were there, but they were unrecognizable in their actions. They moved with an animalistic grace, their bodies contorted as they ran on all fours, their screams a haunting chorus that echoed through the silence of the forest. The scene was surreal, like a twisted ritual from a forgotten time. The moonlight cast a ghostly glow over the clearing, illuminating the transformation of these people I once knew. Their faces, twisted in a feral rage, were both terrifying and tragic. In my shock, I stumbled backward, stepping on a dry limb that cracked loudly under my weight. The sound shattered the eerie harmony of the clearing, drawing their attention to me. Among them, I noticed Robert. His eyes, wild and unrecognizable, found mine, a glimmer of recognition flashing within them before being consumed by the same blood-curdling scream I had heard on the phone. Suddenly, all eyes turned toward me, their expressions morphing into a terrible rage. I was an intruder, an outsider in this macabre gathering. The air grew thick with tension, and I knew I was in grave danger. Fear gripped me, a visceral, primal fear that rooted me to the spot. Part of my mind screamed to run, to escape this nightmare, but my legs froze, chained to the horror unfolding before me. The screams grew louder, a cacophony that filled the clearing, reverberating off the trees. The figures began to close in on me, their movements deliberate, predatory. The terror of the situation jolted me into action. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and fled, running blindly through the forest, the screams of the transformed townsfolk chasing me through the night. The trees blurred past me, branches scratching at my face and arms, the forest itself seeming to resist my escape. Adrenaline surged through my veins as I fled through the forest, my feet pounding against the earth, tearing through the underbrush. My heart hammered in my chest, a relentless drum echoing the terror that consumed me. The fear of being caught by those transformed creatures was a palpable force, driving me forward with desperate urgency. I ran without direction, guided only by the instinct to survive. The forest was a labyrinth, its paths twisted and misleading, its darkness a shroud that masked the dangers lurking within. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the sound loud in my ears, mingling with the distant haunting screams that chased me. In my frantic escape, I didn't see the edge of the ravine until it was too late. My foot slipped on loose soil, and I tumbled down the steep incline, crashing through foliage and scraping against jagged rocks. Pain exploded through my body as I hit the ground, a symphony of agony that drowned out the sounds of the forest. I lay there, a crumpled heap at the bottom of the ravine, my body battered and bruised, my mind reeling from the impact. The pain was intense, sharp jolts shooting through me with every shallow breath I took. I suspected broken ribs, and the thought of moving filled me with dread, but the fear of what was in the forest, of what might be coming for me, was greater. I forced myself to stand, each movement a test of willpower against the pain that racked my body. As I steadied myself, a rustling sound made me freeze. My heart, already beating wildly, seemed to stop for a moment. Slowly, I turned, dreading what I might see. There, emerging from the shadows, was Janice. But the woman I saw was not the Janice I knew and loved. Her eyes, once warm and full of life, were now cold and unfeeling, fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. Her body was twisted, her posture unnatural and grotesque. The sight of her in this monstrous state was a blow more painful than any physical injury I had sustained. This was Janice, yet not Janice, a shell of the woman I had shared my life with, transformed into something unrecognizable. The realization that there was nowhere to run, that I was trapped in this nightmare with no escape, was a crushing weight that threatened to overwhelm me. I stood there, at the bottom of the ravine, facing this distorted version of my wife. The moonlight cast a ghostly glow over the scene, illuminating her features in a harsh, unforgiving light. The forest around Us was silent, as if holding its breath, the trees witnesses to the tragedy that was unfolding. The pain from my fall was a constant reminder of my vulnerability, each breath a sharp reminder of my mortal limits. But in that moment, my physical pain paled in comparison to the emotional agony of seeing Janice like this. The woman I loved, the partner I had cherished, was now a creature of the forest, a victim of an unknown force that had stolen her humanity. A groan of despair escaped my lips, the sound a testament to the heartache that gripped me. Tears streamed down my face, blurring my vision. The fear that had propelled me through the forest was momentarily replaced by an overwhelming sense of loss. I fell to my knees, the rough underbrush scraping against my skin as I looked up into Janice's eyes. My voice trembled as I spoke, a confession of our shared dreams spilling forth. I talked of the future we had envisioned together, of children playing in the sun, of growing old side by side. My words were a last plea, a desperate attempt to reach the humanity that I prayed still lingered within her. For a fleeting moment, as I poured out my heart, a distant memory seemed to flicker in Janice's eyes. It was a mere shard of the woman she once was, buried deep beneath the monstrous facade. Her body halted, the animalistic movements ceasing as she listened to my trembling confession. Then, from her throat, a growl emerged, transforming into a semblance of human speech. "Get out! Further!" The words were guttural, strained, as if it took all her remaining strength to form them. Without another glance, Janice turned and vanished into the forest, leading the other transformed creatures away from me. Her scream, a haunting echo of the Janice I knew, reverberated through the night, a chilling reminder of the reality that had claimed her. I remained on my knees, the tears drying on my cheeks, as the silence of the forest enveloped me once again. The moon, a silent observer, cast its pale light over the clearing, illuminating the scene of my heartbreak. The journey back to my house was a solemn march under the early rays of the sun, each step a testament to the despair that weighed upon my heart. I limped, my body a canvas of pain from the fall, but it was the agony within that overshadowed any physical discomfort. The loneliness that enveloped me was a tangible force, as real as the trees that lined my path and the ground beneath my feet. I trudged on, each movement a battle against the overwhelming sense of loss that threatened to consume me. I clung to the memory of Janice's fleeting recognition, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had descended upon our lives. It was this sliver of hope that propelled me forward, the possibility that there might be a way to bring her back. The thought that there could be a cure for this bizarre affliction was a beacon in the night, guiding me through my grief. But as I reached the familiar confines of my home, the emptiness of the place was a stark reminder of the reality I faced. The house, once filled with laughter and love, was now a mausoleum of memories, each room echoing with the absence of Janice and the life we had shared. The days turned into weeks, and Janice did not return. Neither did Robert, the deputy sheriff, nor the other townspeople I had seen in that haunting clearing. They had vanished, swallowed by the forest and the mystery that it harbored. The realization that I had truly lost Janice, that she had been taken from me not just physically but in essence, was a slow poison that numbed my senses.
Story 2.
The sun had long since set behind the horizon, plunging the national park into impenetrable darkness that seemed to swallow the very soul of the forest. The only source of light was the pale moon, casting long shadows that danced and writhed as the wind whispered through the treetops. I had been a park ranger for over 10 years, but the eerie silence of the night never failed to send shivers down my spine. I stood and breathed in the scent of the wild forest, the clean and fresh air clearing my thoughts. My name is Daniel, and I grew up in a small town near the park. The vast expanses of wilderness always called to me, and when the opportunity arose to work in the very heart of the place that captured my imagination as a child, I couldn't resist. As I sat at the ranger station, I remembered the last report of a missing person. A family of 4 had gone hiking in one of the remote areas of the park, but only 3 returned. The father, a man in his 40s named Thomas, had gone alone to gather firewood and never came back. Search teams combed the area for several days, but he was nowhere to be seen. It seemed as though he had simply vanished into thin air. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm me. The weight of my responsibilities was becoming heavier with each passing day, and the thought of sleep was becoming more of a distant dream than a reality. The worn leather of the chair creaked beneath me as I stood and stretched, feeling the aches in my bones that only years of work in the wild could bring. Another long night, I muttered to myself as I stepped out into the cold, crisp air. The stars overhead seemed almost close enough to touch, their twinkling light reflecting off the snowy ground. The night was quiet, except for the distant howl of a lone wolf, whose mournful cry echoed through the darkness. I decided to take a walk to clear my head, hoping that the peaceful tranquility of the night would help calm my anxious thoughts. As I strolled along the winding path leading away from the ranger station, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. My instincts, honed by years of living in the wild, screamed for me to turn back, but I stubbornly pushed on, determined to confront whatever was making me so uneasy. The further I walked, the more my sense of unease grew until I found myself in a part of the park that was almost unrecognizable. The trees seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers, clawing at my throat. And then I heard a voice, so faint that it was almost drowned out by the rustling of leaves. "Help me!" My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear the voice again. For a moment, there was only silence, and then, just as I was about to give up and turn back, the voice spoke again, this time a little louder. "Help me!" I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest as I pushed through the underbrush. The voice seemed to be coming from a small clearing up ahead, and as I drew closer, I saw a figure huddled on the ground. It was a woman, her clothing torn, and her face streaked with dirt and tears. "Please," she sobbed, her eyes widening in terror as they met mine. "You have to help me. There's something out here. It took my husband, and it's coming back for me." I knelt beside her, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what she was saying. I had so many questions, but now was not the time for that. We needed to get her to safety, and we needed to do it quickly. "Let's go," I said, helping her to her feet. "We need to get you back to the ranger station. We'll figure everything out once we're safe." As we stumbled our way back through the forest, the woman, who introduced herself as Sarah, told me her story, gasping for breath in between words. She and her husband had been on a hike when Thomas went to gather firewood. When he didn't return, Sarah went looking for him, but came face to face with something she couldn't describe. It looked like a person, but not, she whispered, her voice trembling. Its eyes were empty, and it moved in ways I've never seen before. It took Thomas, and I don't know what it did to him, but I heard his screams, and they were like nothing I've ever heard before. Back at the station, I settled Sarah in as comfortably as I could, and tried to make sense of what she had told me. The thought of a creature like the one she described was horrifying, but hardly believable. I had heard stories from the local Native American tribe about creatures they called skinwalkers, beings that could take the form of animals or even other people. They were said to be powerful and malevolent, but those were just myths. In my experience, the most frightening and dangerous creature was human. I called for backup and decided to leave Sarah at the station. Time was working against us, so I needed to urgently set out to search for her husband. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I moved cautiously, my senses heightened, every nerve in my body on edge. After a while, I heard distant cries for help. The sound was faint, barely audible above the rustling of leaves and light wind, but it was unmistakable. My heart leapt into my throat and I quickened my pace. As I delved deeper into the heart of the forest, the cries became louder and more urgent. I pushed my body to its limits, my lungs burned, and my legs ached as I raced to close the distance between myself and the desperate pleas echoing through the trees. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing darker, the air more oppressive with each passing moment. When I finally arrived at the source of the cries, I was met with a sight that would haunt me for the rest of my days. In a small clearing bathed in moonlight stood an elk, its towering form silhouetted against the night sky. But this was no ordinary elk. Its body was devoid of muscle and fat, the skin stretched taut over its skeletal frame. I felt my blood run cold as I realized I was in the presence of a skinwalker, the very creature that had inspired so many legends and ghost stories. For a moment, I stood frozen in place, my terror so great it felt as though all my limbs had turned to stone. But then, when the creature let out a low, guttural growl, I snapped into action, turning to run as primal animalistic fear compelled me to put as much distance between myself and the nightmare in the clearing as possible. As I ran, the forest became a blur, trees and undergrowth whipping past me, carrying me deeper into the darkness. The cries for help echoed behind me, growing more chilling with each passing moment. Despite my terror, I felt a pull toward the sound, compelling me to meet the unknown and confront the malevolent force that ruled the woods. Finally, as I approached the source of the cries, a figure emerged before me, humanoid, yet not quite human. Its skin was as taut and lifeless as the elk's, its eyes empty and soulless, boring into my being. The tracker had transformed, assuming a new, even more terrifying guise. I recoiled, gasping for air, as I turned to run once more, my being consumed by the need to flee from the terror stalking my every step. The forest closed in around me, the darkness pressing down like a weight, and I ran, driven by fear that threatened to consume me entirely. And then, just when I thought I could run no longer, I stumbled upon Thomas, battered and bruised but alive. Relief washed over me, a sudden wild joy that seemed to chase away the darkness, if only for a moment. With each step we took back to the ranger station, adrenaline and the desperate need to escape the terror that had pursued us spurred us on. When we emerged from the tree line, the forest seemed to recede around us, breathing ragged, our bodies covered in sweat and shaking from exhaustion. We took a moment to catch our breath, to relish in the fact that we had survived our encounter with the unimaginable. As we stumbled back to the ranger station, Sarah ran to embrace her husband, tears of relief streaming down her face as she clung to him tightly. The joy of their reunion was a balm to my frayed nerves, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is still hope. But even as we celebrated our salvation, we could not shake the nagging feeling that our ordeal was far from over. In the distance, barely audible over the rustling of the leaves in the wind, came a faint cry for help. The skinwalker was still out there, waiting, and we knew that our battle with the darkness had only just begun.
Story 3.
The dense fog draped over the forest like a sinister veil, suffocating the darkness beneath. I stepped cautiously into the woods, the damp ground beneath my feet giving way to the weight of my boots. It was an odd sensation, as if the earth itself was a living, breathing entity, inhaling my very presence. I, Samuel Miller, was the ranger assigned to this remote region, and the eerie atmosphere was unsettling to say the least.
My job was a solitary one, with only the occasional wildlife and the whispering trees for company. I always felt a little on edge in these woods, even before the peculiar incidents began. There was something indescribably eerie about the way the shadows seemed to dance and intertwine with the fog, like malevolent spirits ready to snatch me away at any moment. I shrugged off the feeling, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. "Samuel," I muttered to myself, "you're letting the isolation get to you. It's just trees, shadows, and fog." The first week on the job went by without any incident. I familiarized myself with the terrain, marking boundaries, and identifying the various wildlife that called this place home. I enjoyed the simplicity of my duties, the peacefulness of the woods, and the brief respite from the chaos of modern life. However, that peace was short-lived. As I roamed deeper into the forest, I stumbled upon a small clearing. The sight that greeted me was as disturbing as it was peculiar. A mutilated deer carcass lay in the center, its innards grotesquely displayed, almost as if it had been deliberately posed. My stomach churned, and a shiver ran down my spine. This wasn't the work of a predator, at least not one I'd ever encountered. It was as if the animal had been dissected by a skilled surgeon. Shaking my head, I tried to push the unsettling image from my mind. "It's just some sick freak," I told myself. "There's a logical explanation for this." But deep down, I knew that it wasn't quite so simple. The thought that something sinister was at play haunted me, gnawing at the back of my mind. Over the next several days, I found myself spending more and more time in the clearing, drawn to the grisly scene like a moth to a flame. I spent hours poring over the carcass, examining every detail, trying to piece together what could have caused such a gruesome display. It was during one of these morbid investigations that I first noticed the strange markings etched into the ground around the deer. The markings were intricate, forming a pattern that seemed simultaneously random and deliberate. I couldn't decipher their meaning, but I felt an inexplicable connection to them, as if they were speaking to some primal part of my soul. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, and the chill in the air seemed to intensify. I decided to consult my closest colleague, Dr. James Langford, a biologist and an expert in animal behavior. He was the only person I felt comfortable sharing my discovery with, and he agreed to come out to the clearing to examine the scene for himself. The following day, he arrived at the site, his face paling as he took in the grisly sight before him. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, his eyes widening in both fascination and horror. "I've never seen anything like this before." "Neither have I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do you think could have done this?" James shook his head, his eyes never leaving the carcass. "I'm not entirely sure," he replied hesitantly. "It's certainly not the work of any known predator. The precision of the cuts, the removal of organs, it's all so clinical. It's almost as if it was done for scientific purposes." As we stood there pondering the implications of our discovery, I noticed James's gaze shift to the markings on the ground. His eyes narrowed, and he knelt down to get a closer look. "What are these?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I admitted. "I found them when I first came across the carcass. They're strange, aren't they?" James nodded, his face etched with concern. "They're more than strange, Samuel. They're downright unnerving. I've never seen anything like this before either." We spent the rest of the day examining the scene, searching for any clues that might shed light on the origin of the markings or the identity of whatever had mutilated the deer. As the sun began to set, the fog returned, and the forest seemed to close in around us. We decided to call it a day and made plans to return in the morning. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The shadows seemed to come alive, and the wind whispered secrets in a language I couldn't comprehend. I tossed and turned in my bed, unable to find solace in sleep. The following morning, I returned to the clearing with James, but we were not prepared for what awaited us. The deer carcass was gone, replaced by another, even more grotesque scene. 3 rabbits lay in the center of the clearing, their bodies splayed open and their organs meticulously arranged in a disturbing tableau. The markings on the ground had also changed, taking on an even more intricate and sinister pattern. James and I exchanged horrified glances, both of us at a loss for words. We spent the day documenting the new scene, our minds reeling with questions and fear. What was happening in these woods? Who or what was responsible for these horrifying displays? And most importantly, why? As the days turned into weeks, the gruesome scenes continued to appear with alarming frequency. Each time, a new animal was featured, and each time, the markings grew more intricate and unsettling. The woods themselves seemed to become darker, the shadows more menacing, and the whispers of the wind more insistent. I found myself becoming more and more obsessed with the mystery, consumed by a need to understand the unknown force at work. I spent countless hours poring over the patterns, searching for meaning in their twisted lines. I began to see them in my dreams, a never-ending labyrinth of darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. It was during one of these restless nights that I first heard the voices, soft, barely audible whispers that seemed to seep through the cracks in the walls of my cabin. At first I thought it was just the wind, or perhaps my own exhausted mind playing tricks on me. But as the nights wore on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until I could no longer deny their existence. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, a series of clicks, hisses, and guttural sounds that seemed to reverberate through my very soul. I couldn't decipher their meaning, but I knew somehow that they were connected to the markings and the gruesome displays in the clearing. As the sun rose on another day in the forest, I found myself unable to shake the nightmarish memories of the previous weeks. My once peaceful existence had been shattered, replaced by a relentless obsession with the horrifying events unfolding around me. The whispers had grown louder, invading every corner of my thoughts and shattering any semblance of sanity I had left. My relationship with Dr. James Langford had also become strained. Our once casual conversations had transformed into heated debates, fueled by our mutual desperation to uncover the truth behind the gruesome scenes and the strange markings. Our shared obsession had become a wedge between us, driving us apart, even as it bound us together in our pursuit of the unknown. As I walked through the forest, the once familiar landscape now felt foreign and sinister. The trees loomed like giants, their gnarled branches reaching out as if to grab me. The shadows seemed darker, more menacing, and the whispers of the wind continued to haunt me with their indecipherable secrets. I found myself avoiding the clearing, unable to face the grotesque displays that had become its defining feature. The last time I had dared to venture there, I had discovered a nightmarish scene that still haunted my dreams. A family of squirrels, their tiny bodies splayed open and their organs arranged in a chillingly precise pattern. The sight had been too much for even Dr. Langford, who had excused himself and retreated to his car, pale and visibly shaken. I knew, deep down, that I couldn't avoid the clearing forever. It had become a focal point for the bizarre events that had consumed my life, and I knew that if I ever hoped to find answers, I would have to face whatever horrors awaited me there. So, with a heavy heart and a sense of impending doom, I decided to return to the site of my nightmares. As I approached the clearing, I noticed that the forest had fallen eerily silent. The usual sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating silence. The air seemed to grow heavier with each step, and I felt as if I were being crushed under the weight of an invisible force. When I finally reached the clearing, I found that it had been transformed once again. In place of the grisly tableau of mutilated animals was a single, massive object, unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was a large, cylindrical structure, made of a material that seemed to absorb the light around it. The surface of the object was covered in the same intricate markings that had become an all too familiar sight, their patterns shifting and twisting as if they were alive. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I stood there, staring at the strange structure. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I felt as if I were on the brink of understanding their message. I reached out a trembling hand, my fingertips brushing the surface of the object. The moment my skin made contact, a searing pain shot through my entire body, and the whispers exploded into a cacophony of unintelligible screams. I stumbled back, clutching my head in agony as the pain threatened to overwhelm me. The screams continued to echo in my mind, their terrible intensity driving me to the brink of madness. I don't know how long I lay there, writhing on the ground as the unseen force continued to assault me, but eventually the pain began to subside, and the screams faded to a dull roar. I slowly opened my eyes, my vision blurred and my body aching. The strange structure was still there, its dark presence an ominous reminder of the horrors I had endured. As I tried to gather my strength and pull myself to my feet, I noticed something even more unsettling. The markings on the object were now glowing, their once shadowy lines pulsing with a sickly green light. The whispers in my mind continued, their urgency increasing as the glow intensified. Feeling a mixture of dread and determination, I decided to call Dr. Langford and inform him of my discovery. I knew that he might not be eager to return to the clearing, but this was something we needed to investigate together. It was far beyond anything we had encountered before, and I couldn't face it alone. When I reached Dr. Langford on the phone, I could hear the concern in his voice as I described the strange structure and the markings that now glowed with an eerie light. Despite his obvious trepidation, he agreed to meet me at the clearing as soon as possible. As I waited for him to arrive, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The whispers in my mind had become a constant presence, their relentless insistence gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I could feel the weight of the object's presence, its darkness pressing down on me like a suffocating cloud. When Dr. Langford finally arrived, he seemed taken aback by the sight of the strange structure. He approached it cautiously, his eyes wide with a mixture of fascination and fear. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, echoing the words he had spoken when we first discovered the mutilated deer carcass. "I've never seen anything like this before." "I touched it," I admitted, my voice trembling, "and when I did, I felt an intense pain, and the whispers, they became screams." Dr. Langford looked at me with concern, his brow furrowed. "Samuel, are you all right? Perhaps we should get you checked out, just to be safe." "I'm fine," I insisted, though I knew my words were far from the truth. "We need to figure out what this thing is and why it's here." We spent the remainder of the day examining the structure, taking photographs and making notes on its size, shape, and the markings that covered its surface. We tried to find any possible way to open or interact with it, but it remained impenetrable, its secrets locked away behind a wall of darkness and pain. As the sun began to set and the shadows lengthened, we decided to return to my cabin to regroup and discuss our findings. The whispers in my mind continued to grow louder, more insistent, and I knew that whatever force was at work in the forest was growing stronger, more dangerous. Over a hastily prepared meal, Dr. Langford and I pored over our notes, searching for any clue that might help us unravel the mystery of the structure and the events that had unfolded around us. We spoke in hushed tones, our voices barely audible above the whispers that seemed to echo through the cabin. "I think we're dealing with something far beyond our understanding," Dr. Langford admitted, his voice tinged with fear. "Something otherworldly." I nodded in agreement, unable to find the words to express the dread that had settled in the pit of my stomach. We were out of our depth, two men facing an unknown force that defied all logic and reason. and as the darkness continued to encroach upon our world, I couldn't help but wonder if we would ever find the answers we sought, or if we were doomed to be consumed by the very mystery that had drawn us together. The following days were filled with an oppressive sense of foreboding. Despite our best efforts, Dr. Langford and I were no closer to uncovering the truth behind the mysterious structure and the gruesome events that had unfolded in the forest. The whispers that had taken root in my mind continued to grow louder, their incessant presence a constant reminder of the unknown force that had invaded our world. As we delved deeper into the mystery, I noticed that the forest itself seemed to be changing. The trees appeared to grow more twisted and sinister, their branches reaching out as if to ensnare unsuspecting prey. The shadows that had once been nothing more than a harmless trick of the light now seemed to writhe and twist, as if they were alive and hungry for something more substantial than darkness. It was during one of our daily treks into the woods that we stumbled upon yet another grisly scene. We had been following a trail of strange markings that we believed might be connected to the structure when we came across the mutilated body of a fox. Its remains had been arranged in a disturbingly familiar pattern, its organs meticulously displayed in a grotesque tableau that mirrored the previous scenes we had discovered. As we examined the carnage, I noticed that the markings on the ground had once again changed. They now formed a series of concentric circles, each one more intricate and unnerving than the last. The sight of them sent a shiver down my spine, and I couldn't help but feel as if we were being drawn deeper into the heart of the darkness that had consumed the forest. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a murky twilight, Dr. Langford and I decided to set up camp near the site of the fox's remains. We hoped that by observing the area overnight, we might gain some insight into the unknown force that was at work in the woods. As we settled in for the night, the whispers in my mind continued to grow louder, their relentless presence threatening to shatter what little sanity I had left. I knew that sleep would be impossible, but I couldn't bring myself to share my torment with Dr. Langford. I didn't want to burden him with the knowledge of the darkness that was consuming me from within. As I lay there, staring up at the canopy of branches that loomed overhead, I began to notice something strange. The trees themselves seemed to be moving, their gnarled limbs swaying gently, even though there was no wind to disturb them. As I watched, the movement became more pronounced, the branches twisting and contorting as if they were alive and reaching for something just out of their grasp. I felt a cold sweat break out on my brow as I realized that the trees were reacting to the presence of the strange markings that surrounded us. They seemed to be drawn to the symbols, as if they were a source of power or sustenance. The realization sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through me, and I knew that we were no longer simply observers in this nightmare. We were now a part of it. I decided that I could no longer keep my secret from Dr. Langford. I needed to confide in him, to share the burden of the whispers that had consumed my thoughts and threatened to overwhelm me. As I turned to wake him, however, I noticed that he was already awake, his eyes wide and unblinking as he stared at the writhing branches above us. "Samuel," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. "Do you see them? The trees? They're alive." I nodded, unable to find the words to express the terror that was gripping me. We sat there in silence, watching as the trees continued their haunting dance, their movements growing more frenzied with each passing moment. It was as if the darkness that had invaded the forest was manifesting itself in the very heart of our world, transforming the once harmless trees into something far more sinister and deadly. As the night wore on, our fear only grew more intense. The whispers in my mind had reached a fever pitch, their incessant screams drowning out all rational thought. I could see that Dr. Langford was also struggling, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror as he stared at the nightmarish scene before us. It was then that I realized we needed to act. We couldn't simply sit there and wait for the darkness to consume us. We had to do something, anything, to try and fight back against the unknown force that was at work in the woods. With a newfound sense of determination, I turned to Dr. Langford and spoke in a voice that was stronger than I felt. "We need to find the source of this darkness," I told him. "We need to hunt it down and destroy it before it destroys us." Dr. Langford looked at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a nod of agreement, he rose to his feet and began to pack up our camp. We knew that our mission would be dangerous, perhaps even suicidal. But we also knew that we couldn't simply sit back and let the darkness win. As we set out into the heart of the forest, following the trail of markings that seemed to lead deeper into the shadows, we couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. The whispers in my mind had become a constant presence, their relentless urgency driving me forward, even as I feared what we might find at the end of our journey. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the darkness seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. The trees loomed like ancient guardians, their gnarled branches reaching out as if to ensnare us in their deadly embrace. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, as if they were alive and eager to consume us whole. Despite the overwhelming sense of dread, we pressed on, driven by a desperate need to uncover the truth behind the strange events that had unfolded in the forest. We knew that our only hope for survival lay in discovering the source of the darkness and confronting whatever force was at work in the woods. As we continued our journey, we stumbled upon more and more scenes of grisly carnage. The remains of countless animals lay scattered throughout the forest, their bodies mutilated and their organs arranged in chillingly precise patterns. It was as if the darkness was leaving a trail for us to follow, luring us deeper into its lair. The further we ventured into the heart of the forest, the more intense the whispers in my mind became. They had grown from a constant nagging presence to a deafening roar, their insistent screams threatening to shatter my sanity. I could see that Dr. Langford was also struggling, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror as he tried to maintain his composure. As we approached what we believed to be the source of the darkness, we found ourselves surrounded by a vast grove of twisted, sinister trees. Their branches writhed and contorted, as if they were alive and desperate to reach out and ensnare us in their deadly embrace. In the center of the grove stood a massive ancient oak, its gnarled trunk covered in the same strange markings that we had discovered throughout the forest. As Dr. Langford and I approached the massive oak tree, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The air around us grew colder, and the shadows seemed to twist and contort, as if they were trying to form shapes that our minds refused to acknowledge. As we drew closer to the oak, the sense of unease and dread only grew more intense. The strange markings on the tree's gnarled trunk began to pulsate with a sickly green light, casting eerie shadows across the grove. It was as if the tree itself were alive, and it was aware of our presence. As we reached the base of the tree, I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to place my hand upon the bark. Despite my terror, I couldn't resist the compulsion that had taken hold of me. As my fingers brushed against the rough surface, the pulsating glow of the markings intensified, and the whispers in my mind reached a fever pitch. It was then that we saw it, the creature that had been lurking within the heart of the ancient oak. It was like nothing we had ever seen before, a nightmarish fusion of flesh and shadow, its body writhing and undulating as if it were made of pure darkness. As the creature emerged from the depths of the tree, we could see that it was not alone. It was accompanied by a host of smaller beings, each one a twisted mockery of the animals we had found mutilated throughout the forest. They swarmed around the creature, their distorted forms a haunting reminder of the darkness that had invaded our world. Dr. Langford and I stood there, paralyzed with fear as the creature approached us. It moved with a grace and fluidity that belied its monstrous appearance, its eyes locked on us with an intensity that sent shivers down our spines. As it drew nearer, the whispers in my mind grew louder, their insistent screams threatening to shatter my sanity. I could feel the creature's presence invading my thoughts, its tendrils of darkness worming their way into my very being. With a sudden, swift movement, the creature reached out and touched Dr. Langford, its twisted appendage wrapping around his arm like a serpent. I watched in horror as he let out a guttural scream, his body convulsing as the creature's darkness consumed him from within. As the creature turned its attention to me, I knew that I had to act. I couldn't let it take me over, couldn't let it subject me to the same fate as Dr. Langford. Summoning every last ounce of my strength, I fought back against the darkness that threatened to consume me, pushing back against the whispers that screamed for me to give in. In a final desperate act of defiance, I lunged at the creature, my hands outstretched in a vain attempt to strike it down. To my surprise, my fingers made contact with its writhing form, and I felt a sudden surge of power course through my body. The creature recoiled in pain, its twisted form writhing and contorting as it let out an unearthly shriek. As it retreated back into the heart of the ancient oak, I could feel the darkness that had invaded my mind begin to recede, the whispers growing fainter and fainter until they were nothing more than a distant echo. As I turned to Dr. Langford, I could see the pain and fear etched on his face. He had been forever changed by his encounter with the creature, and I knew that we would both carry the scars of our experience for the rest of our lives. As we stumbled out of the grove and made our way back to the ranger station, we knew that we had only just begun to scratch the surface of the horrors that lay hidden within the forest. The creature and its twisted minions had shown us a glimpse of the darkness that existed beyond the boundaries of our world, and we knew that we could no longer ignore the truth of what we had discovered. In the days that followed, we tried to make sense of the events that had unfolded in the woods. We knew that we had encountered something otherworldly, something that defied all logic and reason. As we recounted our experiences to the authorities, we were met with skepticism and disbelief. They refused to accept the truth of what we had discovered, instead choosing to attribute the strange events to a series of bizarre coincidences and unexplained phenomena. Despite their disbelief, Dr. Langford and I knew the truth. We had seen the darkness that lay hidden within the heart of the forest, and we had faced it head-on. We knew that we had been forever changed by our encounter with the unknown, and that our lives would never be the same.
Story 4.
At midnight, I received a message saying, "Hi, Robert. I'm sorry to say that I have bad news. Your brother Tom has gone missing. Julie went to look for him and has also disappeared. I reached out to the sheriff, but even he has disappeared. The police department is now involved. I'm sorry I didn't tell you earlier. I urgently need your help. Please call me." I jumped out of bed, wide awake, and immediately called Annie, my brother Tom's wife, who sent me the message.
"Hi, Annie. It's Robert. When did he disappear? What? 3 weeks ago? Why didn't you call me earlier? Wait, Annie, don't cry. Tell me what happened."
2 days later, I was driving to my brother's house in a rental car. He lives near a nature reserve. My brother is a ranger, and as you may have guessed, his name is Tom, and we haven't spoken for over 2 years. We parted ways very badly. The last time I saw him, he was screaming at me to get as far away from him as possible. I did just that. I left and never called or wrote to him again. And now, 2 years later, I'm driving to his house to find out what happened to him. As I said, he lived near a nature reserve. He and his wife moved there 6 months ago. Annie told me that Tom had been very worried about something lately and wanted to leave the reserve and move somewhere else. However, a little over 3 weeks ago, Tom stopped communicating. Annie was very scared and asked me to come and help. Passing by the reserve on a lonely road, I noticed that it was very dense. Tall trees reaching up to the sky, undergrowth through which the sunlight doesn't penetrate, wild animals, pesky insects, rivers and mountains. Such an ancient park has its ancient history, and many different secrets that are hidden in the darkness of the forest. Tom and I grew up near a similar protected national park. Our father was a ranger who loved to take us to wild places. He told us a lot and taught us a lot. Tall, strong, very smart, observant. That's how I remember my father. He was an unbeatable superhero for us. However, one day, he went into the woods and disappeared. They found him after 5 days, or rather what was left of him. A wild beast had attacked him. We couldn't believe it because our father was a professional ranger and knew the park like the back of his hand. But what happened, and the investigation was stopped. Years passed. My brother grew up and followed in our father's footsteps, and I chose a different path. Passing by the reserve, I remembered everything. How we walked in the reserve, played with Tom, and how Mom called us for dinner. Nostalgia overtook me. The smell of rotting grass, the singing of birds in the forest, a ray of sunshine breaking through the treetops, the taste of river water. I haven't seen such a landscape for a long time. I arrived at my brother's house closer to nightfall. The house was lit up and I saw a parked police car near the porch. Annie came out to meet me. She looked very exhausted with bags under her eyes, a gaunt face, and messy, dirty hair. It was clear that Annie had slept poorly and had not been taking care of herself. She invited me into the house and introduced me to the sheriff's assistant and the police officer. We exchanged pleasantries and got down to business. My first priority was to find out when my brother had last made contact, who had seen him last, and other details. According to Annie, the preserve was always known for its vast landscape, diverse wildlife, and peaceful surroundings. She said that every year crowds of tourists and visitors flocked here to relax and witness the beauty of the wild nature. However, over a year ago, the previous ranger who had been watching over the preserve for several years disappeared in the forest. It was a mystery that shocked everyone. No one knew what had happened to him, but everyone knew that something terrible had happened. Extensive searches were conducted, but without any results. No one could find any trace of the previous ranger. Julie, our close mutual friend with whom we have been friends since childhood, who also became a ranger, asked Tom and Annie to move to this preserve as a replacement for the missing ranger. They agreed. The first few days, they couldn't find anything, but the long search yielded results. Tom and Chris found some clue and told Annie that they would soon find the place where the body of the previous ranger might be. However, something sudden happened. One night, Tom came home alone. When Annie asked where Chris was, Tom replied irritably that the son of the previous ranger had left. He got tired of searching for his father's body, changed his mind, and just left. Annie believed her husband's words, so she was surprised by Chris's decision. But since then, Tom became very worried, suspicious, and irritable. He didn't sleep at night, sometimes sat on the porch for a long time, and behaved strangely. Annie asked her husband several times what was wrong with him and what happened between him and Chris. However, Tom didn't tell her. Sometimes he even angrily shouted at her not to bother him with useless questions. One night, Annie woke up from the noise and realized that her husband Tom was not next to her. She searched for him in the house, but he wasn't there, so she thought he might be outside and went to look for him. It was bright outside due to the full moon, and there were no clouds in the sky. Annie didn't find Tom on the porch, so she called his name and heard rustling sounds coming from further away. As she approached the sound, she saw husband standing closer to the forest, without clothes and barefoot, whispering something quietly while kneeling down as if he were praying. Annie found this strange, and called out to her husband again. Tom suddenly turned around and stared at her with angry eyes, as if she had committed an unforgivable sin. He began shouting in an unknown language and growling at her, then took a stick from the ground and tried to attack his own wife. At that moment, according to Annie, a hand appeared from the forest, very thin and bony, and touched Tom. He immediately fell unconscious. Annie was hesitant to approach him, but eventually took him back inside to prevent him from getting frostbite. The next day, Tom didn't even remember what had happened. He said that it was all just a dream, and went back into the forest. Since then, Annie hasn't seen him. When Annie realized that Tom had disappeared, She called her friend Julie for help. Julie came over and promised to help find him. She tried to reassure Annie that Tom was a professional and couldn't have gotten into trouble. Julie went to look for my brother, but 2 days later, she disappeared as well. According to Annie, on the third day of Julie's disappearance, she heard noises outside her house and looked out the window. She saw someone standing there, without clothes, and in a frightening bent position, shouting and growling in an unknown language. It was dark, and it was difficult to see who this nocturnal guest was, but Annie thought it might be Julie. However, this whole situation scared Annie very much, so she called the sheriff. Sheriff spent a little more time searching and eventually found Tom's bag, which was now stored at the station. However, it too went missing in the end. The sheriff's assistant found his radio, weapon, clothes, and boots, but the sheriff himself was nowhere to be found. Therefore, they had to mobilize all available forces. After listening to Annie's story, I was slightly shocked. Everything that was happening here could not be called ordinary disappearances. There was clearly some third party involved, perhaps even a group of people or a mysterious force. Either way, I had to get to the bottom of this tangled case and find my brother. I apologize for not explaining who I am and what I do. I used to be a police officer, then a private detective, but now I run a security agency. That's why Annie called me. She hoped I could make sense of the situation and help her. First and foremost, I needed to learn more about this nature reserve, so I went to the local library. It wouldn't have been wise or safe to go into the forest without knowing where to go, and without knowing anything, especially considering the fact that 5 people had already gone missing. As it turned out, the library and the internet only had general descriptions of the reserve. It was written that it was a fantastic and beautiful place. This nature reserve was also home to some very special flowers. The surrounding forests were home to red squirrels and many birds and other wild animals. But there was nothing mysterious or mystical about it at first glance. The reserve really did seem like a regular tourist spot, but I felt that something was off. So I went into the first souvenir shop I came across and started asking different people about the reserve. The saleswoman was an old woman who didn't want to answer at first, but a couple of tens of dollars loosened her tongue. She advised me to go to the local hunter, an old man named Bob. He also lived near the reserve, an old house that looked like it was about to collapse. There was a very large tree growing next to the house, so huge that it could be seen from a great distance. There was a broken pickup truck parked under the tree. The old man sat on the porch smoking his pipe. It all looked like a scene from an old movie. I introduced myself, explained the situation, and started asking about the reserve. Bob listened to me and invited me into the house. Surprisingly, the old man turned out to be very hospitable, and we talked until evening. I learned a lot from him. Firstly, there were disappearances in the past, about 50 years ago. A family of 6 disappeared in this forest. Secondly, the former ranger who disappeared first also suspected something, so he came to Bob with questions over a year ago. And thirdly, and this is the strangest thing, the old man is sure that someone like the owner of the forest lives in the reserve. This is not a human being or an animal, but some kind of deity or something like that. Bob is convinced that it sometimes comes out of the forest and takes people with it. The old man also said that I shouldn't go into the forest to look for my brother, because now the trees have awakened, and they are accomplices of the owner of the forest. The trees can deceive me, and he, this old man Bob, is protected from this divine being. The huge tree in his yard protects him. They have some kind of understanding between them. I thanked the old man and went to Annie's. Of course, I didn't believe everything he said. However, Bob did share an interesting story. I arrived closer to nightfall. I noticed that there was no light in the house, and neither was Annie. She left the door open and went somewhere. I decided that maybe she had gone to the town to do some shopping and waited for her until morning. But she didn't come the next day either. Annie disappeared, just like my brother. I reported her disappearance to the police and started looking for any clues in the house. And I found something. In the wooden floor in the bedroom, there was a hiding place, and my brother's diary was there. Why did he hide it in the floor? I sat down to read. We arrived here late at night. I didn't have time to enjoy the views of the park. Annie didn't want to move, but I wanted to. Everything in the old place reminded me of Robert. He's a complete fool. But now it's all in the past. Sometimes I think about calling my brother. But then I remember how he left Julie pregnant, and she lost the baby because of it. So I get angry right away. What a fool Robert is. I remembered how Tom and I had a big fight. He really wanted Julie and me to be together. Everything that happened between me and her was because of Tom and Annie's whim. They literally forced us. Of course, Julie was not at fault. She really loved me. But I didn't love her. And the more we were together, the more I wanted to leave. In the end, I left, broke Julie's heart, and quarreled with my brother. It was despicable of me to leave a pregnant woman, but why should I be with someone who was indifferent to me? Now I think I should have acted less harshly, but what happened, happened. I started reading the next entry. I didn't want to write this, but I have to. Later, I'll give the journals to Annie. It's hard to explain to her everything that Chris and I saw. Honestly, I didn't understand much. It was really very scary. But Chris doesn't seem scared. He was interested, and so was I, but mostly scared. First of all, I have to say that the forest came alive. Anyone who has lived in such places all their life knows the word living forest. But this was different. I feel like someone or something is watching over me and Chris. The trees seemed to breathe, whisper, and call me. I saw how the birds looked at me as if they were intelligent beings. Chris even seemed to be talking to them. This guy is strange. I opened the next entry. Chris left. He scared me. I don't know who he is, but he's definitely not the son of the previous ranger. I saw him, the previous ranger. I was shocked. He was naked and shouting something at me. But I recognized him. It was my father. But how? He died many years ago? I turned the page and continued reading. While I'm still in my right mind, Annie, if you're reading this, tell Robert not to go into the woods, not to look for me. Annie, leave. There were no more entries. I assumed that Tom deliberately hid this diary so that Annie wouldn't find it. Maybe he was not in his right mind. But what made my brother go crazy? Or is there really some powerful creature living in the reserve called the owner of the forest? The police arrived the next day, and we set out to search for Annie and the others who had disappeared. Almost all the forces in the region were involved this time. Helicopters flew over the reserve, while several groups of volunteer rangers, police, and concerned citizens searched from the ground. Over the course of several days, we combed every inch of the reserve, searching high and low, but we found no one. There were no belongings, no traces, nothing. Absolutely nothing. Annie, my brother Tom, the sheriff, another ranger, and Chris and Julie, who were unknown to anyone, disappeared forever. I was very upset because I couldn't solve this mystery. I lost people who were close to me, and I will never see them again. It's hard to put my feelings into words, but I hope that someday I will meet them again.